All right, good morning, everybody. It is episode 6 of Researching Happy. I've been up since 4 a.m. watching soccer, and for those who are interested, and I'm sure that's not many of you, Napoli are the champions of the Serie A in Italy, and that was definitely worth getting up at 4 a.m. to watch a 1-1 draw, but that means they're the champions, so good for them. And happy for the fans who've waited 33 years. But anyway, let's keep moving. This episode is, I'm going to keep this intro short because I think, this episode really is going to speak for itself with Associate Professor Mark Fabian. So Mark, he's just doing such good work. I think that's an understatement, but he's doing such valuable work in the sense that he's pulling together these fields that really don't communicate. So for those who remember the intro video to this episode, to this whole podcast, that's exactly where I wanted to go, was to try and pull together some of these disciplines of psychology, philosophy, public policy, economics. And Mark has written a book on exactly that topic and just, in my opinion, smashed it out of the park. And not too many people are doing that, and I think not too many are doing it well. So this is by far the most technical conversation I think that I've had so far in the show. So get prepared to probably hit the rewind button or whatever you call it now that it's not rewinding, but I'll probably just keep calling it that. Hit the rewind button, that minus 15 seconds thing, so that in case you missed anything, because I think there's a lot of content here and that you won't want to miss it. So thank you to Mark for being on the show. Enjoy.
All right, welcome to Researching Happy. I'm really, really pleased and excited to have Dr. Mark Fabian with us today. I've got a quick bio of Mark's that I will read, and Mark, you can tell me if I've got any of this wrong, but hopefully not. So Dr. Mark Fabian is an assistant professor at the public policy at the University of Warwick. He's also an affiliate researcher at the Bennett Institute of Public Policy at Cambridge University and an associate at the Institute of Social Change in the University of Tasmania. Mark was a Fulbright Scholar at the Brookings Institute in DC and an adjunct lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. Mark's dissertation was an interdisciplinary exploration of wellbeing theory and measurement in a policy context, which is why I'm so pleased to be talking to Mark. And that was later turned into a book by the Oxford University Press as A Theory of Subjective Wellbeing. So thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited for this chat.
No problem. So did I stuff any of that up just to begin?
No, that was all good. Yeah, I'm actually kind of surprised to hear how much policy stuff I've done. Like, it took me a long time to figure out what my branding was because my PhD is in economics, but I do very little publication in economics these days, and I realized I had to kind of steer myself to policy, but it's nice to hear that is that comes through in my bio.
Yeah, well, look, it definitely sounds impressive, that's for sure. We'll see if we can undo some of that, but I doubt it.
Yeah.
So, I just to quickly, we've basically just met, although I have read your book. I didn't finish the last chapter in time, but we'll get there in a second. But I don't know if you've ever had this experience where, I'm sitting here, I'm in Adelaide, in Australia. I'm thinking, we're doing this work. We're looking for, like, we've come across a problem. Who's doing that work? Or if no one's doing it, we should be doing it. And then you find out, there's a guy that's written a book on this whole thing. And wait a minute, that guy's in Australia, or he's from Australia, and he did his PhD here. And I've never heard of him, and the world's just too big, basically. So was really pleased to find out about the stuff that you're doing.
Oh, cool, great. Yeah, that's really nice to hear. I have had some experiences like that, particularly the couple of years that I was at Cambridge. It's happened a few times where I was like, I really want to talk to someone about like moral error theory or something really kind of narrow. And then I'd start Googling around and they'd be like, the best person in the world. And I was like, wow, I wonder where this person is. And I was like, oh, snap. It's like just around the corner.
2 doors down.
Yeah. So that was fun. Yeah.
Very cool. So you're in the UK. You're from Australia. You said you were from Sydney? Or
yeah, that's right. So I grew up in Sydney, in Bondi. And then I moved to Canberra to do undergrad and then a master's and then a PhD. So I was there for a very long time. I don't know how many of your listeners kind of know the difference between Sydney and Canberra, but like Sydney's kind of like, I don't know, LA or something like that, and then Canberra's kind of the Midwest, culturally at least. I mean, the Canberra is the seat of government, but it's very different from DC, I think.
I'm not going to ask you to translate what you think Adelaide looks like, so I'll leave
I've
it
never
there.
been, so I wouldn't.
Oh, haven't you?
No.
All right, cool. Okay. And you made the move from Bondi. You're now in the UK, I guess, in terms of sunshine. How did that go for well-being?
Bleak, mate, bleak, yeah. I've actually always been a bit skeptical of this Kahneman focusing illusions result, that people in the Midwest think they'd be happier in California because the sun's better, but they don't think about house prices. Like, I just don't buy that. Like, because I've lived in Australia where the house prices are insane, but there's also sunshine. And yeah, I would happily take that trade. So
Yeah, okay.
that's a problem. Yeah.
There you go. Kahneman, you're wrong. Just won a Nobel Prize. Don't worry about that. All right. So just to kick off, like why I was so impressed by your book, just even the first chapter is just like, yes, this guy is answering what I was looking for, which was the multidisciplinary aspect. So you're really pulling together the sort of would you say maybe the three fields that are quite focused on well-being? So economics, philosophy, and psychology, and you've kind of got them to speak to each other. So, have I got that wrong, firstly? And secondly, what made you start that? Because it doesn't sound like it was a very easy process.
Sure. No, I think you broadly got that right. I try to bring public policy in there a bit, but I don't think I did a great job, really. I just kind of flagged some of the issues, I think, around translating psychological science into public policy. I'm now doing much more work on the kind of policy front, and actually a lot of the policy work that I do nowadays I think is not super compatible with kind of what I said in the book. And I think there's probably also a lot of insights from sociology, geography and anthropology that I could have brought in too. So I have a colleague at Birmingham, Jessica Pikett, who made this very astute point to me once that just seems totally obvious now that I think about it. But that the well-being of individuals is partially a kind of emergent property of the well-being of a community, and vice versa, and of places. So we have to think much more kind of structurally, particularly when we do policy thinking around what promotes well-being. In terms of, so the second question was, how did I get into this kind of thing?
Yeah, what made you, most people, I guess, when you're maybe an impressionable student, you kind of just you find a supervisor and you do what they do, which means you sort of jump straight into one silo, whatever that silo might be.
Yeah. I guess I found all the silos really unsatisfactory. So all the way back when I sort of started undergrad, like I was doing arts law, left law after 2 years because I found it really underwhelming. Then did a bit of economics, left that as well because I found it really underwhelming.
You're a hard to impress guy. You must be pretty hard to impress.
Mate,
I mean, not like I'm...
Yeah, they always felt really incomplete. And I guess I still have that attitude to a lot of the silos today. Like, why, at the margin, I don't understand why you would get, like, ever more pedantic about, like, I don't know, economic decision theory, rather than just bring in a whole other big chunk of stuff out of sociology or something like institutions or culture, something like that. I just think that gives you a much more expansive understanding of the world than going super deep into a silo. But I do think that this is like a pretty rough way to do an academic career. It's getting a little bit easier, but all the hiring is done by siloed faculties. Most academics think in terms of the top journals of their field to some extent. That's how the signaling happens. So unless you're capable of publishing in top journals across multiple fields, and I think that's usually a matter of having a lot of really good co-authors who can kind of tailor the thinking that you do together to a particular discipline, and I'm very lucky to have that, then I think you're just going to have a really hard time. It's very difficult to signal what it is that you do. It's hard to signal what's valuable about what you do. It's hard to identify your audiences. Every time you move into a new discipline, you have to kind of figure out the tropes of that discipline and the
Yeah.
kind of language that they use. Even little things like when you publish in psych journals, the formatting is slightly different to how you would publish in econ journals, and the kind of go-to statistical methods are different as well. And a lot of people will just take that as a signal that you're an idiot, not that like that your work's just not worth reading because you didn't follow the APA style guide. Yeah, so I don't necessarily recommend being a generalist,
Yeah,
but I do
and
think that yeah, go ahead.
no, I was going to say, just like for the people who, I think this must be shocking for people who aren't involved in like publishing academic works, that, like you just said, a style guide. It's like you didn't wear the right clothes to come here, so you're an
Yeah,
idiot.
fully. Yeah.
Sorry to
Yeah, I
interrupt.
mean, you come across stuff that's unfamiliar, you assume that it must be like an indicator of incompetence on that person's part. And I think that transcends the style guide to all sorts of stuff.
Yep.
As soon as you're taking an angle on a problem that's unfamiliar, people will just be kind of thrown by that.
And so, yeah, okay, so you're sort of like, you're not happy with what you're seeing. How many other disciplines can we insult? But, it was economics, law. And
Yeah,
so
I mean,
you
they're
just
all
thought,
really good disciplines. That's not what I'm saying. Like, I think they all have a lot to offer. Particularly at that time as an undergrad, I was mostly looking for answers to nihilism, and I didn't
okay,
feel like that was coming out from many places in particular. And I did a lot of philosophy, but I think the ANU where I was based, which is one of the world's top philosophy departments, is very analytic in its philosophical style, and I didn't really know what that meant as an undergrad. But I think analytical philosophy is not super interested in nihilistic themes.
okay.
Yeah,
And so
the
what,
psych
just for a bit of
faculty-
clarity on analytics, like what do you mean by analytic philosophy and compare that to other
Right. So there's this
types?
distinction in philosophy between analytic and continental philosophy. So roughly like British and American versus European. And then there's the Eastern tradition, which is now starting to become a bit more widely studied. And analytical philosophy tends to have a much more of a kind of formal logical style to the way it analyzes problems. So it tries to create a lot of distinctions and use classificatory regimes, and then kind of pit concepts against each other, and use a lot of intuition pumps, which is this method where you kind of look for counterexamples to certain claims, and then reason through those counterexamples until you arrive at a more compelling conceptual articulation or something like that. Whereas continental, I should say maybe the famous analytical philosophers are people like Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein, Whitehead, Rawls probably on the politics side, stuff like that. And then on the continental side, it starts with Kant and Descartes, but I don't feel like they're that distinct from the analytical tradition. I would say that continental really starts to distinguish itself kind of mid-19th century with the existentialist movement. So
Yep.
the style of people like Nietzsche is just radically different from
Yep.
the analytical style.
Sure. And so, okay, so you're looking for maybe a continental style in an analytical department that pushes you out of that silo maybe to find something else?
Well, I basically just like bombed out of university at that point. So this is a story for anyone who like thinks that you can't get into an academic career unless you like tick all the boxes from the very beginning.
Yeah, I
Like
love
my
this.
undergraduate transcript is a dumpster fire. So yeah, I just kind of got over uni, read about a bunch of other stuff that I found interesting. I worked as a tennis coach for several years, that sort of thing. And then I came back into development economics, like thinking that I was completely done with kind of well-being and that sort of stuff. And I came into development economics because I was working as an editor for this website called East Asia Forum, which does Asian policy issues. And the guy who ran that was an economist. And he encouraged me to go to some of the conferences that he was organizing. And just the people that I met there, I felt like these were my people. Like they were interested in practical problem solving, in what's kind of right now, not what's ideal. But they were still very robust and rigorous about what they were doing. And so, yeah, then I did economics, which was a pretty long slog because I had to do maths bridging and a bunch of other stuff like that. And then I really fell in love with statistics, which I think maybe happens to a lot of people. but I'm not sure. Anyway, I got really enamored with statistics, and when I went to do my PhD, I wanted to do pretty conventional happiness economics, I guess, just like research with life satisfaction data. And my supervisor, Bob Bruning, is actually an econometrician, so he's specialist in statistics. And we got about, I don't know, 2-3 months into that project before I decided that I didn't think life satisfaction scales were a particularly valid research instrument, which I presume we'll talk about a bit in this episode. And then Bob was like, okay, well, explain that to me. And I did, and he was like, yeah, that seems pretty bad to me. And then so then after that, I felt that what was kind of the reason why I felt like a lot of subjective wellbeing studies in particular was maybe not realizing that its measures were questionable and not producing a lot of insights that I thought were all that powerful was perhaps because there wasn't enough theory in the discipline. And then that's where the project came from, this big kind of interdisciplinary mashup of what wellbeing is. Yeah.
Cool. And so, I mean, for the audience, I've still we're only for this show, we've got at this time in the world, we have one published episode. So I'm speaking to an audience that I don't know that exists. I assume you're out there. Or I guess I hope you're out there. Bear with us. I don't know what the market share is of talking about statistical analysis of satisfaction with life scales and things like this. But, for those who are interested, stay with us. So what I was really pleased with when I was reading your book was, firstly, how well it seemed you'd read across these three disciplines. And you're kind of working towards this like grand unifying model of well-being. Like I really did think that sounds like if you would probably never call it that yourself, but it did really speak to me that you've ticked off and you've sort of aligned the multiple theories that are out there into one sort of central narrative. So when we're talking about well-being, maybe give us a bit of a brief overview of what it is you're thinking about and in your book and in your work.
Okay, cool. So I like the philosophical definition of well-being, like the very high-level definition, which is just it's whatever makes someone's life go well, or more formally, what is intrinsically good for them. So just in and of itself, it's good for you. And good for is this kind of key term in philosophy, as opposed to like the aesthetic good or the moral good, these kind of things. It's the prudential good is what we're talking about with well-being. So there's this very important ethical element to it from the beginning, and defining it requires a value judgment. And I think that plays havoc for philosophy of science and is also quite important in the policy domain, and that's kind of what I work on nowadays. But what I was just trying to do in the book, particularly in terms of folding the philosophy stuff in, was to kind of sensitize psychological science to some of these ethical issues. I think what I was trying to explore in the book, but I only realized this after I'd published it, sadly.
And you have to speak specifically what's in the book, I guess. If it's evolved since the book, that's also cool.
Oh yeah, cool. No, I'm happy to talk about the book. It's just the phrasing of it. So I think what the book is about is trying to develop a model that explains people's lived experiences of their own well-being. So this is quite distinct, I think, from like the philosophical project of trying to figure out what is well-being conceptually in all possible worlds. And I think it's also quite different from what subjective well-being studies does, which is this kind of very operationalist thing where it just says subjective well-being is whatever is measured by these instruments. And is also different to what clinicians are trying to do in terms of defining mental health and that sort of thing, where they sort of have to have a bit more of an objectivist take. Whereas I'm really interested in people's own experiences. So the original motivation was something like, when I was younger and depressed and things like that, I was looking for answers. I was like, I'm unwell. Can someone give me advice on how to be well? And like I said earlier, I was pretty underwhelmed by the advice that I found. So in philosophy, the three major theories of well-being are that it's pleasure, that it's about satisfying your desires, and that there's an objective list: knowledge, happiness, virtue, etc. Right, and I don't think any of these are very practical. You go up to a philosopher and you say like, "Oh, I'm unwell. How can I be more well?" And they say, "Oh, we'll just have more pleasure." And then, like that doesn't work. And also, just satisfy your rational, well-laundered preferences, which is the economics kind of view. Also, just doesn't work well. And I think the clinical stuff is much better. Personally, I feel a lot of resonance with like Carl Rogers's work, self-determination theory. These ideas have a lot of roots in clinical practice. So yeah, I was trying to develop this theory of the lived experience of people's well-being, and I think as we talked earlier, the different disciplines are all siloed and don't really talk to each other, and so I thought it'd be useful to integrate the perspectives that they had. I thought it was possible to create some theory that was like consistent with all those different perspectives, and I think in philosophy in particular, there's a tendency to always distinguish theories, and I thought, well, why don't we try, even just as like a thought experiment, putting them together rather than pulling them apart. Yeah.
Look, and I think, I mean, do you feel that it worked, pulling them together?
Yeah, I think it did work. Certainly, I'm quite satisfied with the outcome in terms of like I could apply the book in my own life. I think I do apply the book in my own life. And so far, talking to philosophical audiences about it and the kind of applied audiences about it, people seem pretty receptive to what I said there.
Yeah, I just really got this sense reading through, we have this issue in the world, maybe it's social media sort of mediated, but often people are talking past each other. And I think silos, the silos of academic practice are a really good example of that, where, we just speak sort of different languages. And I think I was just so impressed that, you sort of taken the time to say, well, actually, what if we speak about this the right way, and if we frame these various theories correctly, sort of amongst themselves, then it all makes sense. There is actually one sort of succinct narrative between them. So, I mean, I don't know if you can quickly sort of go through some of what's...
the narrative.
Yeah, is
sure.
that okay?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so the model I put forward has two parts. So one is well-being as an outcome, or like what is the state of being well, something like that. And then the other is the process by which you achieve that state. I think historically we've tended to separate those two things, and I think that's dumb. So in philosophy, there's a tendency to talk about what is well-being and then what is instrumental to it. So how do you get it? And my view is that actually when you step back for a second to think about how you get any of the things that might intrinsically be well-being, then you realize that they require each other in order to get any one of them. And so this instrumental intrinsic distinction is kind of a distinction without a difference.
Yeah.
And then I think in the psych literature, there is this distinction between the hedonic theories that are mostly about well-being as an outcome variable, experiences and evaluations, and then the eudaimonic theories, which are about the way that you live and whether you're living well. And I think if we put these two things together, they actually merge quite nicely. And I think Frank Martella and Ken and Sheldon's stuff merging them, and I think Todd Kashdan's done some work on that too. Is really good. Like I think we can just keep progressing on that amalgamation. So in any case, I probably should also say that I think if you try to achieve well-being in the wrong way, then you won't get there. So we need a kind of a theory of the process too. All right. So
and then just to pause then, sorry, did you just say that the hedonic, you liken the hedonic tradition to like the definition of what is well-being, and the eudaimonic to the instrumental version of of how to get well-being? Were you making that analogy there?
I was. I mean, I wouldn't be,
like it's
if I was to defend that in an academic article, I would spend a lot of words on that.
Yeah.
That's quite complex. Yeah.
You've got a whole book on it.
Version. Sorry?
I mean, you've written a whole book on it, right?
Yeah. I think the best way of thinking about eudaimonic theories at a high level is that they're about living in a particular way, and usually in a way that accords with your human nature. And then in the philosophical tradition, that human nature, usually the characteristics that they emphasize is virtue and rationality. In the psych literature, it's much more about the kind of organism that a human is, and what we've evolved to be like and what sort of systems we have. I'm much more compelled by the psychology tradition on this front. Like, I actually think the empirical literature in psych kind of just disproves the philosophical tradition. Um, Yeah, so anyway, so the outcome, well-being as an outcome, I take to have kind of three dimensions. You have a pleasant life, a fulfilling life, and a valuable life. The pleasant life, I think, is broadly in line with what subjective well-being researchers study. And I think that's unsurprising given that subjective well-being research in psych came out of hedonic psychology. And they were interested in happiness mostly. So if I remember correctly, Ed Diener and his son wrote a book, the kind of popular book about happiness psych, and his wife has a preface in that, and she says that Ed wanted to study happiness, but he didn't think his colleagues would take him seriously, so he called it subjective well-being to make it sound more scientific. And I think that's kind of totally understandable from Ed, and I agree with his assessment. But also, like, a lot of the confusion starts there.
Yeah.
If it was a theory of happiness, we'd have way less confusion today. So then within those three dimensions, I think, so within the hedonic dimension, the pleasant life, you've got a preponderance of positive over negative mood. So you're generally like feeling good. And that you're what I call hedonically satisfied, which means that you think your life is pleasant. You would assess it as pleasant. But I think it's useful conceptually to distinguish between what's hedonically pleasant or hedonic satisfaction and what I call existential satisfaction, which is broadly that you feel your life is fulfilling and valuable. So I find this to be very common among bourgeois university students, and I would count my own experience in there. You get to uni and like life's good, you know, you've got friends, you're well fed, you're entertained, the sun is shining in Canberra, etc. Like life is very pleasant, but you might have ennuis, kind of like existential boredom. You might feel like you don't really know what you should do with your life. You don't really know whether you're a good person, what it means to be a good person. You don't have any purpose. And when you kind of start reaching for potential purposes, if you're afflicted with nihilism, so you think that it's difficult to kind of ground your values in some kind of transcendent structure, then you could maintain that your life is very pleasant while also being kind of unwell about it. So then you need to bring in these other ideas, I think. And I feel like these ideas are kind of missing to some extent from American culture. So it's not kind of surprising to me that a psychology school coming out of America is a bit blind to them. Just as a real quick tangent on this, Will Davies in his book, The Happiness Industry, has this amazing chapter on the kind of history of American psychology faculties and how after World War II, they sent a lot of their best grads over to Europe to study from like the vestiges of Freud's school and Jung and Adler and all this kind of stuff. And they were horrified by what they found. They were like, all these Germans, they just want to talk about metaphysics. And they went back to America and started to do more empirical stuff in the kind of behavioral tradition and often ended up in business schools in the marketing department. And I think that's a really interesting distinction in the history. So anyway, that kind of European tradition is more present in the fulfilling and valuable set. In fulfilling, I basically use the three basic psychological needs from self-determination theory. So as an organism, the human needs autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And if you have those three things, then you'll broadly feel like your life is fulfilling. You'll feel pretty steady and structured. One thing that I think is kind of missing from that paradigm is that, in Nietzsche's words, humans need periodically a reason why they exist. Like we need a sense of purpose. We need to feel like what we're doing is valuable. We need to be plugged into some system of meaning and value. There's this big research that's really quite excellent in positive psychology around meaning in life. But I think that literature, so I put meaning in the valuable life camp, meaning and purpose. What's missing from that literature is the answer to nihilism. Is like, okay, like my purpose is building matchstick models of the Titanic. Like maybe, like you might have a lot of intrinsic motivation for that. It might give you flow. But it's few people can really kind of sustain a sense of purpose if they don't have a kind of culture around them that reinforces that the things that they're doing are valuable. So you can even think of just really simple stuff, like in a lot of middle-class households, it's just very very encouraged to be a doctor or a dentist or something like that. And like, if you go to university, you get good grades, you make good money, you have a nice house, you have a nice partner, you have good kids, etc. Like, your whole society comes around and just kind of celebrates you for being the backbone of civilization. And if that kind of cultural reinforcement of your values is missing, then suddenly the sense that your life is valuable and fulfilling kind of drops out. And then I think there's this huge literature in existentialism in particular, but also some of the early psychoanalytic work like Frankl or Erich Fromm that we can use to build this kind of more robust theory of the valuable life, which includes feeling like you're a good person and that you're pursuing moral ends. And that's quite, I think, substantial to well-being, and certainly the most important thing for me personally. So I wanted to make sure that that got folded into the psych literature. Mm-hmm. I can go on to talk about the process, but if you've got another question in the meantime, hit me up.
No, let's keep going.
All right, cool. All right, so then that's kind of well-being as an outcome. We want this pleasant life, this fulfilling life, this valuable life. Then we need the process by which we achieve it. So that life is going to be different for each individual person. We're all going to have different values that we want to pursue, different activities that bring us joy, different people that we're friendly with, that we feel good around. So I think crucially we need a theory of learning. So how do we discover the values that are right for us as an individual? I think a lot of the kind of dev literature in the capabilities tradition is a little bit naive about this maybe. So over the last 100 years since World War II or whatever, it's been really important that we just have economic growth and that we have broadly an expansion in people's ability to live the lives that they want to live. So this is the capabilities idea. We need not just income, but health, education, political enfranchisement, whatever. That's great. But I think even once you have all that, like the constraints on your life are relaxed, you still don't know how to use all these tremendous resources that you have to live a great life because you don't know what the good life is for you. Okay, so then I tried to develop this model of learning that I call the coalescence of being, which kind of harkens back to when I did more philosophy. So the basic idea is that I kind of construct it from a few different psych theories. So the first one is self-discrepancy theory from Torrey Higgins, who was at Columbia. I think he's still active, actually. So his idea, again, is clinical. So he was trying to explain kind of the origins of depression and anxiety. And he said that humans broadly have these kind of three archetypes of the self. They have their ideal self, who they want to be, their actual self, which is who they are, and then their ought self, which is who they think they have a responsibility to be. And then more recently, there's the feared self, which is who you really don't want to be. And so we try to harmonize these concepts, like bring our actual self into alignment with the ideal self, subject to a constraint imposed by the ought self. That's one way to think about it. And often you'll get this wrong. So this kind of gives you a high-level goal. And I find it easier to explain this with ambitious high-level goals, but they don't need to be ambitious. So you think about, like, you want to be an astronaut. So you've got to bring your actual self, this like 18-year-old, not so fit, not so educated person, has to become an astronaut. And then that's going to inform all these lower-level goals. Like, if you need to be fit, you've got to join a gym. You probably want to get a personal trainer. You want to buy some TheraBands, like that sort of stuff. So it's going all the way down to your shopping list. Then you start doing these things. So you start trying to behave in a way that brings your reality into line with the change that you want to be in the world or whatever. As you go about that process, you're going to get feedback. So some of the feedback is going to be affective. So it's going to be emotional feedback. It's going to be motivational feedback. And some of it's going to be social. So other people are going to give you information about what sort of person you are, for example. And then you're going to have to introspect on that feedback and calibrate these ideal selves and the pathway that you take to them on the basis of that feedback. So for example, if you want to be an astronaut, you might think, okay, I need to get fit. And I also need to learn more about astrophysics. So I'm going to enroll in a extraterrestrial chemistry course or something. So now you're doing these activities. So you're going to the gym, you're going to your chemistry classes. And you find that the gym, well, actually, let's take a positive story first. So first, everything's awesome. You love the gym, you love chemistry, you just double down on it further. And this expands then into your life in a broader way. So you like that the gym makes you buff, you're really impressed with your aesthetics, you meet a life partner through gymnastics, it helps you focus on your chemistry classes, just all going well. So gradually you develop this more kind of integrated identity that weaves all these things together, and you get closer and closer to being an astronaut, which just makes you feel really good. So you're getting a lot of positive affective feedback all the time. You really like the people in the gymnastics club, so positive social feedback. You just keep going. But that's unlikely. I don't think that happens very often. Usually you're going to get some kind of conflicting messages that you then need to think about and think through. So say maybe gymnastics is not going so well. You've got to think about, well, maybe do I like exercise? It's just not really gymnastics that I like. Or maybe I like gymnastics, I just don't like the people at this club. They're all bitches. I need to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just the case that like everything about gymnastics sucks. Like you don't like exercising, you don't like athletes, and none of it. It's just all bad. All the feedback is bad.
Yeah.
But you're really liking your chemistry classes. So now you might think that what we need to do is change the ideal self. So we can't be an astronaut because we just don't want to be that fit. But maybe we could be an earthbound scientist who's using the data that the astronauts sent back. And then that recalibration of your ideal self changes a lot of the nested goals. And now you're pursuing a bunch of slightly different values and behaviors that are giving you broadly more positive rather than negative feedback compared to what you were doing before. And so generally you're just kind of steering yourself towards the positive feedback and making these calibrations along the way. There's a lot more I could say about it, particularly in terms of like self-determination theory and stuff like that. But the basic idea is that as this process proceeds, you should end up with a preponderance of positive over negative affect. You should be closer to the life that you ideally want to have. So you're going to feel that your life is pleasant. You're going to be satisfied with it. You're going to be autonomously pursuing the things that you want to do. You're going to be building competence in things you care about, and you're going to be hanging out with people that give you positive social feedback and that you vibe with. So there's your fulfilling life. And then you're going to be pursuing values that are compatible with your ought self and that you think are meaningful. Like you're like, astronauts do cool shit. So that's going to take care of the valuable life, and you're going to have an identity, which is a substantial part of that valuable life as well. So this is how the process gets you to the outcome. All right, I hope that was a good summary.
Yeah, no, that was, excuse me, that was very, very good. What I love about what you're talking about is that it's an active process, you know, like I think I hear this all the time of kids saying like, oh, I'm at uni, but you know, maybe I'm going to take a gap year because I don't know what I want to do. I mean, probably I'm sure you would have said that at some point. I said it too, but no one gives them the advice that you just gave them, which is that actually this is a very active process to be walking. You know, you can't just sit back, get a job in a cafe and just think like after a couple of months, this thing's just going to click and it's going to all make sense to me, you know? And there's no amount of, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but there's no amount of thinking that can find that answer, that it's like, it's an exploratory thing. You have to be firstly, consciously, I don't know if you really spoke about this, but you know, should it be a conscious thing of constructing your ideal self? Should you consciously spend time and think about that so that then you can set those sub goals? Are you kind of thinking about it more in an unconscious way?
I definitely think you should do some of it consciously. So I think the two pop cultural tropes that concern me a bit is that people always giving you advice. And that's kind of looking outside. You've got to turn inwards, first of all, and consult yourself for advice. And then the second one is the one that you mentioned. I'm really glad you brought that up. Like, you can't just think about it. So I think there's a tendency in a lot of philosophical and religious circles to think, well, there is the good. It's out there. And if we just sit here and think about what the good is, eventually we'll figure it out. And then we can live in accordance with that. I basically reject that out of hand, but I think it's completely wrong for the individual's personal well-being. So you got to try out a few different things. Even if you're in a very religious community and you kind of vibe with that, you're still going to have different roles within that community, and you've got to figure out which one's right for you. And I think in figuring that out, some of it's going to be unconscious. Like I think the intuition is very powerful, very wise, and that we should give it time to send us messages. But the intuition is generally going to be more effective if you feed it information that
Yeah.
it can digest.
Yeah.
And sometimes you get very complex signals from your intuition. And I think there you really need that system one thinking, conscious frontal lobe to kind of unpick those signals. So I'll try to give you an example if that's useful.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, like,
Um,
and I guess the point here is that none of this is necessarily easy either. It's not that,
No.
just go out there and you'll figure it out. It's also that. But please, your example.
Oh yeah, no, it's not easy at all. There's a really great quote from Carl Rogers where he basically says something like that, like, I'm convinced that this process of self-actualization is not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the example for me is that, like, I was really, really into tennis for a long time. At one point, I was on court maybe 45 hours a week, and then in the gym
Seriously?
another 15 or something. Yeah, like a lot. And then I started to go back more towards uni, but I was still playing 30 hours a week or something. And then I had this really bad back injury that basically meant that I couldn't play at all for about 3 years. And I was just doing yoga and Pilates, which I really didn't enjoy particularly much. And when I came back from that, I just couldn't play tennis at the level that I was accustomed to. And my physical abilities had also deteriorated. Like, I wasn't as fast as I used to be and that sort of thing. And I kind of got this sense that I would never be able to play tennis the way I used to be able to play it. And I eventually decided that I just wasn't going to play tennis anymore, basically. Like, I played once a week in DC just with a friend, mostly to hang out with him. And I really tried not to put any pressure on myself to play better or anything like that. And it was quite complex to kind of think through my emotions around that, where I was like, am I letting go of something that I actually really love quite deeply, but it's actually quite painful for me to play it at all because I just feel shit at it now compared to what I used to be capable of. And I think those kind of experiences where some exogenous shock sort of forces you to reassess a lot of quite fundamental aspects of your personality, you're not going to be able to work through that just unconsciously. Like, you've got to let the emotions come through, let them feel how you're feeling, but then you also have to reflect on what's going on.
Yeah, cool. And I mean that's that idea of suffering for growth. Everyone gets it in the gym. Like, you have to work hard, and that hurts for gains or whatever, for growth. You don't see that so much in they're really the happiness sort of industry. I think you wouldn't really get that. I think it's coming now, and people have written books about it, like Kashtan and Biswath Dina that you talked about, and a few other people that I'll probably forget. But so I think that's just another important point, I guess, really, isn't it? That this is not comfortable, but probably that is an indicator of growth in some form or another.
My ex had a really nice line in this regard. She said, "Wellbeing is about wholeness, not happiness, and wholeness is much more demanding than happiness."
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
Wholeness. I like that. I've written it down a note, which is, what do you like? We won't go into that just yet, but so have you thought, so you've got this theory. Another reason I think why I like, there's lots of reasons why I like this stuff that you've put together, but we've been working on a project where we're kind of getting towards, we're really quite fed up with this issue of language in wellbeing, and that it's just so poorly used, really. You talk about well-being, we can't even spell it the same way, let alone things like happiness. Are we talking about happiness meaning a positive emotion, or are we meaning as a multi-dimensional concept as akin to well-being? I don't have to tell you about these issues. So what we did was we did this this big sort of review of all the measures that are out there. People have taken the time to operationalize what they thought well-being was. And sort of long story short, I'll put a thing to the preprint as in the show notes, but we get to this point where we've synthesized, we find say more than 400 different words that people are using in their measures of well-being. And when you synthesize them down, it's actually really about 21 different things.
Okay.
What I loved about, they're mostly outcomes because obviously they're measures. So they're things that they're probably actually confused between, is this instrumental to well-being, like you say, or is this an outcome of well-being? Like that's not clear at all, I don't think. But what I loved is that yours, so we're sort of moving towards this idea of forming a taxonomy, of what do we mean by mental health and well-being. And a couple of the collaborators that we've been working with, I've kind of mentioned this thing of like, would you impose a theory or some sort of structure on this taxonomy? So you've got all these domains, but do you want to sort of map out how these things are related? I've probably been resistant to that so far because I think let's just get them out there first, and then maybe interdisciplinarily we could think about something like that. But I did note while I was reading your book that basically everything that we had in those 21 different dimensions mapped somewhere to your work. Which I just thought was exciting. I don't really know what to do with that fact, but I just thought it was kind of cool. I felt like you basically haven't missed anything from the literature is basically how it seemed to me.
Okay, cool. Thanks. I mean, that was kind of the objective, like try to integrate as much as you can and try to make sense of that landscape rather than say, well, actually these things that some people think are well-being are something different.
Yeah.
And only this is well-being.
Yeah.
Try to put all that together as best as possible.
Yeah. On the well-being sort of definition thing. So someone, we've just spent maybe half an hour on like your model of subjective well-being or of well-being. Someone on the street asks you like, what does it mean to be well? What's your answer? Do you have one?
What does it mean to be well?
Or what does it mean to, what is well-being?
There's a quote. So one line, I think it's from, so Gandhi has a version of it and Goethe has a version of it. So Gandhi's is something like, it's when, how you think, wait, I'm going to pull it up.
All right, yeah, go for it. Go for it.
Give me a second here. I'll have it pretty quick. Okay, where are we at?
Guessing Gandhi quote comes up with a fair few results.
Yeah, here we go. Happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony.
Yeah.
Quite like that one. And then I don't have the Goethe one close to hand.
So something like it.
But I think the Goethe one is actually in my book as one of the chapter headings. So give me one sec.
That's all right. I was hoping to hold up your book, but I bought it on Kindle, so it's kind of like not really as satisfying.
Yeah, here we go. To think is easy, to act is hard, but the hardest thing of all is to act in accordance with your thinking.
Yeah, cool.
So I think another way of phrasing this is from Valerie Tiberius's book on well-being, it's called Wellbeing is Value Fulfillment, and I really like her theory. And she thinks that well-being is about value fulfillment, but that you require particular sorts of values, and they're values that have to integrate or make consistent your emotions, your motivations, and your cognitions. And I think this notion of kind of harmony or consistency, lack of dissonance, integration, that you're a grown individual, that you're whole, and that whole thing is coherent. And so if you feel that you have strong reasons for doing something, but your emotions point in a very different direction, that's a problem. You need to harmonize that in some way. So that's broadly my short definition.
Yeah, cool. So I it's World Happiness Day the other day, and the World Happiness Report comes out, and we got a phone call from the media team at work saying like, the radio wants to call and see why is Australia like number 12, and just whatever, the same sort of thing. You thought we'd be higher?
Yeah, I did think so. But we have like a very large migrant population, and I think as they transition to a better life, they often pull down the average slightly. Yeah,
well, I mean, and this is kind of where I'm going, and this is not really like, I'm in no position to be insulting that organization that pulls it together. I think it's a really valuable thing that they're doing, but it's this confusion of happiness, It's this confusion where if you look at the way that they define happiness, it's really, really particular. And, the thing that separates us from the Finnish who are, top every year, I think one of the bigger things is like trust in institutions.
Yeah.
Which is not something that I think traditionally people would put under happiness.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just find this, it's just like it's at every level, this confusion. Any
Yeah, I mean, I
comment there
guess I
on?
agree. Sorry?
So I was going to say, I guess I didn't really have a question there in the end. Sorry about
Okay,
that. But
sure.
any comment on
Yeah,
that?
yeah. Um, well, yeah, so I guess there is a bit of confusion. So I think a lot of people want a way of thinking about progress and development
Yeah.
that goes beyond GDP, but then
Yeah.
also even beyond the capabilities framework. So beyond health, education, environmental quality,
Yeah.
enfranchisement, etc. And so you get something like the New Zealand wellbeing framework,
Yeah.
which has like all that kind of objective stuff, and then also a few things that are more kind of psychological variables,
Yeah,
like how satisfied you
and
are.
just for context, like a subjective stuff, we're talking about like quality of housing, availability of these things.
Yeah, stuff you can like see and feel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Something that you can verify independently of someone's opinion.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's interesting that because I guess the World Happiness Report, like the authors of that, and like Jan, for example, is a co-author of mine
Yeah,
on some other work. So most of them are pretty committed to kind of life satisfaction as an all-encompassing alternative to GDP, and they want to see it used in cost-benefit analysis instead of income and prices and that sort of thing. So I think in some ways it's actually a coup that the World Happiness Report pulls in more than life satisfaction. So I'm broadly like on board with that. Yeah, and I think Frank Martella, who I mentioned earlier, he's Finnish, and he gets asked every year to comment on the World Happiness Report, and he has a blog somewhere that I can try to dig out for you for the show notes, maybe, where he explains what he thinks it is about Finland.
Cool.
And he also says that it's mostly about like institutions, and it's mostly about the social safety net and the way that pulls up the bottom of the distribution, where you get really big improvements in people's well-being. Whereas stuff that helps the top, like income growth, not that relevant.
Yeah, no, and that's, I guess, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to get. I'm not to say that any of those objective things are not valuable. They're obviously extremely valuable. But that idea of, because I've seen like already New York Times articles saying like, how do we be as happy as them? But, obviously coming from a different definition of what they mean by happiness. Even the choice of what to call this show, like I've stayed away from the term happy as best as I can until now, obviously, because I think it's just it is in my mind the catch-all word that kind of most people sort of get what you mean, even if it doesn't really have a very clear definition. So going back to your model, I know this is kind of took a weird segue there, and then we'll come back, sort of learning as a host, but. What are you trying to do with the model? Like, is this something that in what way are you trying to sort of translate that into the world?
Right. Good question. I guess my thinking on this has evolved a lot just in the last 2 years.
Oh, cool.
So I'm writing a pop book at the moment. I guess I hope it'll be out, it'll be with the publisher at the end of the year, and then it's kind of on their commercial cycle. So I think sometime in 2024.
Yeah. Got a title?
But originally my objectives were like self-help. And I find it very frustrating that a lot of the wisdom about well-being is so scattered in these different silos, and then there's like a real tendency to have kind of 3 cute studies that show something, and then to just run wild with that and write a pop book and have these like chapter length anecdotes and stuff. I find that really frustrating, because then you have to read like 300 pages to get one small idea. Could have been a blog post, whereas I think actually books, like, we shouldn't just have blog posts. That's really bad. We should have books, but they should be like meatier, more substantial. So my interest was mostly in self-help, and I guess I still hope that even academically this book will shake things up a bit in terms of orienting thinking a bit more towards practice, like how do you get well-being in your life. I find a lot of the scientific and philosophical scholarship just not very helpful on that front, actually. When I first wrote it, I did think a bit in terms of like, okay, well, once we sort of know what well-being is, how can we then translate that into public policy? But now my view is that that's really just like the wrong-headed way to think about public policy. That's in the public policy literature, and I'm thinking in particular of the public administration, public management literature that's about sort of everyday governance. This is like roundly criticized, this kind of view that the scientists kind of figure it out and then government does it. That results in shit policy, almost universally. And unfortunately, I see most of my colleagues moving in this direction, like trying to create databases of happiness policies. That really aligns well with the way scientists think about evaluation in terms of randomized controlled trials. But most public policy is not a discrete intervention. It's not like we did X and now we're going to assess it.
Yeah.
Most public policy is a system that delivers a huge range of stuff, a lot of complex interrelated outcomes. So you think about health. The health system is enormous. It's like a massive part of GDP. It's got millions of people working in it. And your health is a composite thing out of all sorts of stuff. And so it's not really the case that we can like discretely do interventions on public health, broadly conceived. There's also then a whole bunch of issues around political legitimacy, procedural legitimacy, and administrative stuff. So how can we change the way governance is done so that it promotes well-being? And that's kind of what I'm working on now. So I hope that the book still contributes to the self-help side, but my original ambitions to kind of think about public policy using the model I've jettisoned substantially. One thing I'd still like to do is that I think there's too much of an emphasis in a lot of the research or a lot of the kind of science into policy scholarship to think in terms of getting metrics first and then using the metrics to figure out what causes well-being. And I don't think that works. I mean, it does in some cases, but because of the systems issues and a bunch of other stuff, I think that's a clumsy way of doing things. I think what we want to do instead is have a kind of well-articulated mechanical understanding of well-being, and then we can use that to develop policy ideas and think theoretically about what policies might work, what policies might not work, how we might evaluate those kind of policies, given that they're very hard to evaluate. So I'm hoping that the book still informs policymaking of that type.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. Something else I've got from you reading your work, and I read through. I've got it right in front of me. I can show this one. It's got a coffee stain on there. Sorry about that. Your work with, I think so. It shows that at least it was near enough to my coffee. So this is, again, I'll put it in the show notes, Mark Fabian and Jessica Piquet. It's titled Be Happy, Navigating Normative Issues in Behavioral and Wellbeing Public Policy. But again, what I thought you're really hammering, like what you're really nailing across all of your stuff is this idea that what psychology is doing at an individual level is valuable. What maybe economics is doing or public policy is doing is equally valuable, or, forget about equally, just like it's valuable in its own right. But if you try and take the techniques and the methodologies from one and apply it to the other, it just completely breaks down. And I think I saw that with some of the life satisfaction work that you've been talking about. The difference between measuring life satisfaction of an individual versus the satisfaction of a nation. That these are really different things, and one doesn't necessarily work for the other.
Yeah, I've got a few reactions to that. I actually think life satisfaction kind of, a bit like supply and demand, sort of works better at this kind of mid-level. So supply, like rational choice theory, which is the workhorse in economics, doesn't work at the individual level. It's totally shit, like really flimsy. At the aggregate level of market behavior, it's beautiful. It works so powerfully. And then again, at the very macro level of kind of whole national economies, starts to become much wobblier again. And I kind of feel like that with life satisfaction as well. Like life satisfaction tells you so little about an individual. So we're doing research at the moment. It's kind of an adversarial collaboration where we interview people for like 45 minutes about what their life satisfaction is determined by and how they map that to their scale, how they use their scale. And like the kind of complexity that people are trying to communicate with this one number that they give you is so vast. And I don't see why we would try to use this one number to capture that. By the same token, I think saying that, the Finns are 8.1 and Australia's 7.9, and like, what does that mean? I don't think that tells you anything, basically. And I think the whole like running regressions on international comparison data is really fraught. I mean, some of these countries have 15 times the population of some other ones, totally different cultures, different demographic makeups, whatever. I'm pretty skeptical of that sort of work. But at the kind of this medium level of, say, like a town or something like that, or looking at a map and seeing kind of pretty substantial differences in some cases across parts of that map, then you can start to feel like, oh, well, there's something here that we should really dig into. So I'm kind of open to life satisfaction at some scales. I think can be quite powerful.
Yeah, and I guess that's the nuance, I guess, of what I'm appreciating in your work is that nuance that I haven't seen it so clearly anywhere else, I don't think.
Oh, thanks, man. Appreciate it.
That's okay. That's absolutely fine. Yeah, and I guess I also read Alexandrova's book, and I thought that was of a similar sort of style. Obviously, that idea of mid-level theories was again, I think throughout that book, and that idea of I was just reading as well this morning your paper on democratizing wellbeing measurement. And it's just,
thanks,
it's okay. That's okay. No, it's just amazing. Once again, like we'll talk a little bit about our wellbeing intervention that we've got or maybe we won't even talk about it. I don't know yet, but it's once again, it's like we're doing something so similar to this, and then here's this group on the other side of the world doing almost exactly the same. I think that we've probably like intuited it a bit more naturally because we don't have that sort of philosophical sort of political background. But again, you're sort of putting into words what we're sort of working on without that next level of sort of academic or philosophical rigor. So it's really exciting to read, basically.
Thanks.
No, that's
I
great.
should say I think we're kind of coming behind practitioners on that work. So I think in the development policy space in particular, in social policy, in mental health research, there's been tons of effort to try to do more participatory public policy and participatory interventions where you get the people who are going to be affected by whatever it is that you're doing to come in very early in the process and define what they want the outcome to be, how it should be measured, that sort of stuff. That hasn't had the most coherent epistemological architecture around it or ethical architecture around it. And then meanwhile, there are these other debates going on in science in particular around conceptualization and measurement and stuff like that. And I hope that our paper kind of tries to pull those two things together. But we're very much inspired by the practitioners that we see, and we're just trying to articulate what it is that they're doing.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's the exact experience that I had this morning. So,
Great.
I don't know if this is irrelevant or not, but, like literally I was in preparation for this. I was up early this morning reading some of those papers. Could have been earlier, obviously, but, on the days is sometimes how it has to be done. And I'm reading these things, and it's like early in the morning. I'm sending them to my colleague Yoop, who's been on the show by this stage,
cool.
and it's like he's today writing up, summarizing a project that we've been working on, and it's like here's the reference of someone who's done basically exactly what we've just done. We had no idea, obviously, that it was out there, and again, you've given us a little bit more structure than probably what we had, but it's just I don't know, it's just such a cool thing. So I'm pleased.
It's a great feeling.
Yeah, it is. It is funny. It's like, I don't know. It's, people talk about the zeitgeist. I'm kind of more and more, I'll probably believe that more and more, this idea that, there's kind of an idea in the air and people are sort of all ticking onto it around the world at the same time. So it's kind of nice. In terms of then that paper, you've kind of mentioned this idea that this idea of technocracy. I've seen that now. It's in the paper today. We've sort of spoken about it a little bit via email. Talk about what you want to see in the world. What is it that is getting in the way when it comes to this idea of technology?
Cool. Well, so I guess I think we're in a high tide of anti-elite sentiment, and I think with Trump and Brexit and populism everywhere and all that. And I think a lot of the roots of that are in the overreach of technocracy and a kind of bit of a hangover from the 80s. So before I was doing wellbeing work, I was doing a lot of economic policy. My first book was on mixes of government and market tools in public policy. And in that book, we talked about how the 1980s was this kind of golden age of really good technocratic reform. So go.
Oh, sorry, I was going to interrupt. Can you just give me a quick definition of technocracy?
Yeah, sure. So it's ruled by experts.
Yeah.
So decision making in the context of public policy is handed over to experts of some sort. The canonical example is central banking. So central banking used to be handled by governments, by elected representatives, and very good evidence that they cocked it up repeatedly. So it's always useful for a government to have loose monetary policy going into an election because it kind of froths the economy. And so everything seems like it's going well under this government, but then once they get elected, then that comes back to bite you in the ass. So since we've had independent central banks with these inflation reduction mandates, we've had much steadier monetary policy, much more predictable macroeconomic conditions. And there's still tons wrong with macro, but I do think we're in a much better spot than we were like 70 years ago. In the 80s, that was a kind of tumultuous macroeconomic period. We had stagflation, which we're kind of experiencing a bit at the moment as well. So a period of low growth, high unemployment, high inflation. It's kind of quite scary. And the solutions to that were all in massive microeconomic adjustments, broadly towards more market forces. So we had to stop price controls, reduce subsidies, float exchange rates, generally allow the market to allocate resources in a lot of areas rather than central planning. And that worked really well, and it was informed by the kind of thing I was talking about earlier. So not like evidence in the RCT way that we think about it today, just kind of painstakingly pieced together economic theory that was like logical, had some empirical basis, this kind of stuff. We felt like we understood things pretty well. And I think broadly the legacy of that in the countries where it was done under left-wing governments like Australia, Canada, the Scandinavian countries has been really good. In the US and the UK as well, it was quite good, but much more like ideologically prosecuted by the Thatcher and Reagan administrations, and so there's a lot of bad baggage as well. And I think after that period, economists in particular became a bit like arrogant. They were like, we figured it all out, and really like the public can just go and live their lives. They're going to have a good time because we're going to keep everything rolling. And since then, we've had this explosion in inequality at the very top end, and a lot of unsustainable stuff, which seems to be a consequence of economists' models being a bit limited. And I think a lot of economists still think that they can just solve this using analysis, and that public policy should just be a matter of, and I used to think this, full disclosure, so the public elects representatives that they trust. The representatives go to the technocrats and say, okay, these are the issues we want dealt with. Give us some options. The technocrats say, here are the 3 best options. And then the politicians pick the one that's most normatively aligned with what they care about. I think broadly that doesn't work. That's just kind of like a fantasy that economists have. But unfortunately, I think the wellbeing movement, as it comes out of science at least, is very much kind of piggybacking on this idea. So they're like, we just need national wellbeing accounts, and we need scientific development of wellbeing policy. And then we can just have a psychocracy, so a technocracy of psychologists. And this is what Jessica's always complaining about, my co-author on that paper. And I think this is particularly problematic because in economics, the definition of wellbeing is whether people can satisfy their own preferences. And that's how nudges work. In psychology, though, there's a view that your preferences might be harmful to your well-being because your well-being is like good psychological functioning or happiness or whatever it might be. And so you run into this very dangerous Brave New World territory where a technocracy is giving advice to an elected official, a decision maker, that is against the citizens' interests or against the citizens' preferences on the grounds that it's going to be good for their well-being or whatever. And that like really is a toxic mix with anti-elite sentiment, with kind of populism and all that kind of stuff that we have going on at the moment. So I'll stop there, but we're working on a kind of alternate paradigm. Anyway, back to you.
Yeah, no, it's completely fine. So let's talk about the alternative paradigm, because I think the question that's in the back of my mind, I don't know whether whether it exactly applies to this, but this idea that, the scientific method is obviously very powerful. It has its place, but it's not everything. And I'm wondering whether, from your multidisciplinary background, what else are you seeing that would have more of a place here?
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. So I think we want to put multiple things together, and the scientific
Yeah.
method and the robustness that that brings in terms of
Yeah.
knowledge generation is a crucial piece of the puzzle. Then
Hmm.
we also need to have like political legitimacy,
Yep.
procedural
What do you mean
legitimacy.
by that?
People,
What do you mean by that?
yeah.
Like
So I mean that
like
people
true.
need to feel like they are in charge of their worlds.
Yeah. Yep.
If I give a kind of acidic example, so the most powerful piece of political rhetoric in Australian history, I would say, over the last 30 years, was that statement, I think, by Alexander Downer from Adelaide, in relation to boat arrivals and refugees, that we will decide who comes to this country and the conditions on which they do so. And that's kind of reflected in the Brexit rhetoric around taking back control and all this kind of stuff. If people feel like their politicians are talking to some like unclear cabal of scientific people and business interests and all sorts of stuff like that, and not to the public, then they'll start to feel very disenfranchised, and then we'll end up with a lot of things that are very concerning to the technocrats. Like Trump's assault on free trade globally was a huge disaster from the economic profession's point of view. So I think we need to have scientific robustness, this kind of political enfranchisement. And then the third thing is related to the political enfranchisement, but is kind of the ethics in the context of well-being. So not having the scientists define what well-being is, what makes a life go well, but letting citizens tell you what it is that makes their life go well. Now, obviously, sometimes citizens are going to say stuff that is kind of wrong. But that's why you need a forum, a kind of deliberative mechanism in which you have the people who implement the policy, so the practitioners, we call them,
Yep.
the people who are affected by the policy, so the citizens, or the people with lived experience, and the technical experts all together, and crucially, they have to be sharing power and they have to be learning from each other. So it's not the standard consultation model where the government has already made a decision heavily constrained by what its technocratic advisors have told it, and then comes to the public and says, do you approve or whatever. It's much more deliberative than that. And we have a situation where the technical experts have to come in and be open to the idea that the citizen is going to know more than them about crucial issues like what well-being is and how it should be measured. And then similarly, that the practitioner is going to bring a lot of really important insights in terms of what's implementable. So I'll give you just one, hopefully quick example on that.
Doesn't have to
The scientific community, particularly economists, think that public policy is like synonymous with cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
If you talk to people on the ground in social policy, in health, in education, almost universally, they complain about cost-benefit analysis, that they are forced to crowbar the complexity of what they're doing and the difficulties of measuring it into this framework that is passed down by some treasury bureaucrat in London or in Canberra or wherever it might be, who doesn't implement policy, they just pay for it. And they don't know anything about this particular area and its richness and its complexities.
Yeah.
And so the practitioner is going to tell you a lot about how day-to-day this area of policy happens, what measures would be useful to them, what decision-making structures are going to be effective, all this kind of stuff. So we are trying to develop a methodology for developing, you mentioned Anna's work before, these mid-level theories, so context-specific well-being frameworks for areas of policy. And that might be a demography, it might be something like social care, it might be a geographic area like a national park or a town or whatever, where we bring these three forms of expertise together, they learn from each other, they share decision-making power, and then we maintain that scientific robustness, so we maintain some level of rigor, but we also have these other normative values in there that we care about.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And like I said, we've just finished this piece of work, which is basically like in your language, it's in the mid-level theory of, or in the context of mental disorder. So what does well-being look like? That's what, again, reading your was it called like Drive to Thrive or something, the charity that you were working with? Or something?
It's called Turn to Us, but we were
Turn to Us, sorry.
The theory of thriving for them. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, okay, sorry. So just, it was obviously
it was
pretty
thrive,
early.
not survive, not just
Yeah,
survive.
okay. Thank you. So anyway, so like that was a particular context. We've been working with an organization in Australia for this exact thing of like, can we, we often, the caricature, I guess, definition of well-being, we use it all the time, but, like feeling good and functioning well. Yeah. People with a mental illness would say to themselves, I don't feel good, I don't function well, therefore well-being is kind of off the table for me. And that's obviously not I think that's not what the literature says, number one, but secondly, it's just not the experience that we want to be giving to these people. So working now with those with a lived experience or a living experience has been exactly so powerful. And it's just that's why it was just perfect timing. It's just funny how these things
Great.
sort of fall out, but really cool. The other thing I guess I was thinking while you were talking there was like the cost benefit analysis. It really is geared to one outcome, like the cost and the benefit on one outcome. How are you sort of factoring in, because, wellbeing is obviously multidimensional just to begin with, that's complex enough, but you obviously don't want to replace other important metrics like health, like quality of life with a focus on wellbeing. This is not a replacement thing. This is a complementary thing, I'm assuming. How will your this framework that you're building help to make this like a multifactorial analysis?
Yeah, great question. I guess that is the research question in some ways.
Cool.
So I'm hoping to partner with, which I probably can't announce this publicly yet,
That's okay.
but like
Don't do it.
some governments in the UK who are developing kind of wellbeing frameworks for use in policy. And then the question is like, how will they be used in policy? As far as I can tell from New Zealand, it's kind of underwhelming, but maybe not. Like, it hasn't been used that much in New Zealand. They're still relying a lot on legacy methods, but like that's fine. Like, I don't actually think we should be that dramatic in this changeover, because I think sometimes the way I think about it is like we have really quite good measures and good methods for working with income and prices and economic growth. So the methods are good, the analysis is good, but the values are wrong. Like, we don't care about that stuff as much as we used to. So, but when we turn over here to where the values are right, like the kind of well-being, sustainability, that sort of nexus, the measures, and particularly the analysis, so how we make that compatible with the public policy architecture we have, is much messier. And so we can't just jump from this to that. But we also shouldn't hang on to this way that's causing damage. So I find a lot of economists are like, oh, we can't use this stuff because it's not compatible with cost-benefit analysis. And I'm like, why is cost-benefit analysis a good thing? We see plenty of examples where it's shit. It works really well for big infrastructure projects, I think, and defense spending and that kind of stuff. Much worse for like community infrastructure, complex interventions like social work, schools,
well, I guess things where the outcomes aren't as easily, assessed.
Yeah. Can't quantify it easily, can't put it into a unidimensional index easily, can't monetize it easily. Yeah. Right. All the usual things that economics sucks at. So I don't know why the economists aren't willing to let that one go. Just be like, yes, that is indeed the things that we are bad at. Maybe there could be an alternative.
It's funny. I guess from the outside, you probably assume, I think I make this mistake all the time. You assume that, the experts, the technocrats or whatever, like you think they're above human nature in a way, but what I'm hearing here is like, absolutely they're not. It's like, this is the way we do it because it's kind of the way we've always done it. It's probably the way we know how to, so we're comfortable doing this. Anyway, just a quick question on like, how are you, this kind of work, it's really exciting. Obviously it sounds like you're kind of answering, it seems to me that you're answering a question that nobody even realizes is an important question yet. Like most of the rest of the world seems to be not even noticing that this is an important question. By the time they've figured that out, you will hopefully already have an answer. So how are you, is it difficult to fund this stuff?
I don't know, because I've only just reached the point in my career when I'm starting to apply for large grants.
Okay.
So far, no, I guess. Or like there seems to be decent enthusiasm for this stuff.
Yep. Great.
I think it helps that I'm in the UK, which I think is the government that's the most interested in this stuff with the deepest pockets. So like obviously Bhutan and New Zealand more interested in it, but maybe not quite as much architecture as in the UK.
Yep.
I don't find it too hard to get funding for it. It is difficult to find partners sometimes. So anytime you're working with government, there's going to be a lot of concerns about leakage of information out before the government's willing to talk about it, that sort of thing. I think it's fundamental to my attitude to wellbeing policy that we're going to have to muddle through and that there will be mistakes initially.
Yeah, no, I agree.
This kind of stuff. And that makes partners nervous.
Government partners in particular, I would imagine.
Yeah, so I'm working with some charities as well, and they're much more open to
Yeah.
kind of moving fast and breaking things. Yeah.
Great. Nice. All right, cool. So I had one more question that I just wanted to ask. So I think
Yeah,
we've been pretty technical this conversation so far, which has been really enjoyable, I have to say. You've got, I'll link this out, a video from a recent conference about why, you know, some of the issues that you think there are with life satisfaction measures. I think it probably applies to many other sort of well-being measures. So people can watch that video. I think it's like 20 minutes.
sure.
I wish I was at that conference, by the way, but that's a different story. You know, so you're basically saying there's an issue with there's a potential issue with the validity of some of the, like, particularly, let's just say, life satisfaction measures. Let's focus on that specifically, because I think that's what you're focusing on. I think it was like some of your preliminary work is sort of saying, like, you know, it might not be as bad as what we think, but there might be a bit of a question mark, a bit of an asterisk on some of this stuff. How much, when you sort of look around at, you know, the literature so far, like, does that put a big asterisk on, like, to what degree does that shake your belief in some of the sort of the papers that are out there?
It's a tough question. So,
Because it's a pretty fundamental thing. You're basically like, if we're saying
Yeah.
all of these measures are based on these indices, and there might be a fundamental flaw with them.
So we find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to create sign reversals. So if an effect is positive, we can't make it go negative. So it's really about...
Say more
the
about that.
effect.
What do you mean by that?
So, all right, let's just take income because it's the most studied correlation. So there's a very famous kind of curvature in the income life satisfaction relationship that when you're poor, it has really big effects. And then once you hit the kind of global middle class, it flattens off very rapidly. I don't think it's possible for us, regardless of how we if we take the most extreme negative results that we find in some of our work, like discouraging results, I guess, there's no way for us to make that relationship go downwards. Like we can't make income reduce your well-being.
Right.
So that's what I mean by a sign reversal.
Yeah.
So a plus or a minus in front. And I think broadly, any of the results that are big, consistent correlations, like health is good for your well-being, or good for your life satisfaction rather, migration from a relatively underdeveloped to a developed country is good for your life satisfaction, these kind of stuff, I don't think we can change that. So it's really a question of the precision rather than the gist. Like I think the gist is pretty good. My concern, I guess, my deeper concern is that I don't find a lot of the high-level analysis using life satisfaction particularly earth-shattering. Like, so a lot of the epidemiological work that's like, oh, relationships are good for your well-being, and being part of a community is good for you. I'm like, duh. Like, I just don't. Yeah, I feel like if you sit in the armchair or you read the philosophy or whatever, like these themes all come through. I don't think we need to kind of reinvent the wheel statistically. The more complex, difficult stuff like self-actualization or this comment that I made earlier about the well-being of communities as an emergent property of that place that relies on some complex systems-based analysis. That sort of work requires quite precise instruments, I think, a lot of the time. And if life satisfaction is not precise, then it's going to hamper us in doing that work. And I think that's quite concerning to me. I'm very skeptical of any results in life satisfaction research that have very small effect sizes that are statistically significant. We're using these massive data sets like Hilda in the World Values Survey and stuff. It's going to be statistically significant just because the N is so huge. If the effect size is like 0.012 of a point or something, it's just not relevant. Like, who cares? And I don't really think that we can turn that into public policy. Like the policy issue there is going to be some bigger political economy structural story about getting post-capitalist, post-Protestantism, something like that. So that I'm skeptical of a lot of these, like, just grinding out empirical research that, in a publish or perish ecosystem, people are going to do that. I'm not upset about them for doing that, but I don't think we're learning much from those kind of studies. The issue that I'm more concerned about is that there's a huge investment in life satisfaction scales as the instrument of choice in our field. And I think that's a worry because to my mind, they're not that suitable for the actually hard, important questions that we need to ask.
Great. All right. Well, I think that's probably a place to wrap it up. Was there anything that sort of you wanted to say on the back of this conversation so far? Anything that you wish we had covered?
You asked me one question in the prep about like what I want to see in the world or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's one point that I'll make that's not in any of my work to date, but that will hopefully be in my next kind of academic book, which is, I just mentioned this, like post-Protestant values. We talk about post-capitalism a lot, particularly around sustainability. But to my mind, one of the biggest transformations that we need, and that I do see in the intergenerational change between, say, the current professoriate, so the kind of 60-year-olds and above, and the younger people, is the move away from work as like really crucial, fundamental to well-being, to instead focusing on like activity and engagement. So there is an emphasis in this kind of, I think, broadly the Protestant or post-Protestant, because it's lost all its religious, altruistic undertones. This idea that like work makes you godly, idle hands do the devil's work, that sort of stuff. And a lot of our public policy outcome variables are oriented around re-employment, skills for employment, always employment, gainful employment, get cash. Whereas I think if we have more of an emphasis on, are you active and engaged in your life? So you're not idle, you're not adrift, but you might be doing volunteering. You might be pursuing your hobbies for art. You might be doing care work or other things that are not in the market economy. And those are really fundamental to individual well-being and even more fundamental to community well-being. And so I think that's something that I would like to hear more conversation about, is a shift in orientation away from getting money and more towards self-actualizing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm laughing to myself because I think my friend's dad, I heard him say this like just a couple of weeks ago, like, oh, you guys, you're like the purpose generation. It's like exactly what you're talking about. He's kind of like old crusty kind of, exactly, like and as if that's a bad thing. Anyway, that's I think that's really interesting. I mean, where do you want to see that come from? You want to see it, like, you want to see data on this, or you want to see like where should this discourse be happening?
I guess in the culture, but I'd hope to see it flow through to the public policy. So I think in the culture it is already happening. You see the younger generations, as you say, putting a lot more emphasis on purpose, self-actualization, identity, this kind of stuff. People leaving work on time, having work-life balance, not putting up with shit that the older generations did put up with, that sort of thing. But then in the public policy, I think it's going to take a long time before the boomer values that are deeply embedded in a lot of public policy shift out. But I worried sometimes that, for example, this focus on cost-benefit analysis among economists, including happiness economists, still kind of plays into the existing objectives around re-employment. So just as an example, oftentimes greater funding for psychological therapies by the state is justified on the grounds that it will get people back into jobs, and so it will pay for itself. And like, okay, like we need to get those psychological therapies funded. Like, I'm here for that sort of strategic behavior, but I think we're just reinforcing this idea that what's good is if people are working. Whereas actually what I want is for people to be self-actualizing. And oftentimes that requires healing, not coping. And so then our mental health framework is also often about coping with your mental health, getting on with it, dealing with your shit, this kind of stuff, when actually we should give people the space to just fall to pieces, be a mess for like 2 years, but actually rebuild yourself on solid foundations. And that requires a very different attitude to how we think about ill-being.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and I guess that really brings us all the way back to where we began, which is, your definition, or that first definition of well-being as whatever makes someone's life go well. And you're sort of basically saying, well, let's challenge the assumption that whatever makes someone's, the assumption that someone's life goes well when they're working, hard at work, whatever. let's challenge that now. And you're saying you're starting to notice that now. So,
Yeah.
yeah, really exciting. Where should these values come from? Can I just ask? Sorry. I know I was sort of hard up against time, but it's like, we're gonna replace these values. You sort of talked about like capitalist, post-Protestant. Where should these values come from? I mean, is there an answer to that in your mind?
No, the culture. I think this is changing. It's just a matter of having discourse. That's why I'm putting it out there. Like, these are the values I have. This is what I think is good.
Yep.
So I try to compel people, and if they hear my arguments and they find them compelling, then hopefully they'll change their views and they'll talk to other people as well. I think that's the only way to do normative change in a society is through the culture and through the discourse. I'm doing a lot of thinking and writing at the moment about meta-modernity, which is the kind of cultural mode that comes after postmodernism, which I think is what we're in right now. It's what's emerging right now. And I definitely see these themes that you mentioned: purpose, care, and kindness. So like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which won all the Oscars this year, that's a very, very meta-modern film, and its main tropes are nihilism and being kind to people. And I think these kind of cultural artifacts, as they come out and people in the zeitgeist kind of really grabs onto them, as that happens, then we'll see that cultural change. It's not something that I want policy to be involved in, or that I want scientists to be saying, like, scientifically, these values are better for you. That's basically always bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah, because it doesn't align with the sort of the fundamental assumptions of the scientific model, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Anyway, so very cool. This is really exciting. I have probably a million more questions, but I want to acknowledge that, I really appreciate your time, Mark. This has been a real pleasure. The work that you're doing, I just think is so impressive, and really look forward to seeing it continue.
Great. Yeah. Well, thanks very much for having me on the show.
Thanks
for organising the show, and hope that you get more guests, more views, and all that. It's good stuff. Good for the discourse.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Cheers.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. Again, a huge episode with Dr. Mark Fabian. Thank you again, Mark, for your time. I hope everyone enjoyed the show. Like I said before, that was definitely the most technical we've had so far. So a bit of a change of pace. And look, if you're enjoying, subscribe. You can find us on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, and on YouTube. But like I've been saying for the last couple of weeks, just share this with one other person that you think will benefit from this. And that's really what I'm here for. So thank you again, and see you next week. Forza Napoli.